Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. My name is Jeffrey and I'll be your host. Today is part 2 of our Indentured Servants Podcast. Last time we talked about how Ben and Lucy Stephenson acquired their first 3 servants and slaves, and then we kind of talked about their time coming into the Illinois territory, and we finished up with the War of 1812. Today's part, we'll talk about when Ben and Lucy moved to Edwardsville and how the dynamic of the servants changed and what happened to them in the end. So let's get started with Ben and Lucy moved to Edwardsville in 1816. When they came to Edwardsville, they brought 7 servants with them. Once they settled in Madison County, 4 more servants were added to their household. All 4 servants were under the age of 10 at the point of indentured. Mariah was the oldest at age 6. Caroline was 4 and the second oldest. Louisa was 2. And Barksley was the youngest. He was only 42 days old when he technically signed his indentured contract. We believe these 4 children were of one of the female indentured servants to the Stephenson family. By law, the children were indentured because their mother was an indentured servant. Lineage for slaves and servants went through the women because really the women had no legal rights. So if your mother was a slave or a servant, then all of her children would be a slave or a servant. If the law were to go by the father's lineage, it kind of muddied the water for his future children. Specifically, when a slave owner had a child with a slave or a servant, the child was still a slave because their mother was a slave or servant. If the law was changed to go by the father's lineage as a free white male, that child would technically be born free. And that's not the point of slavery or servitude. You want to keep the slaves and their children in bondage, and then when a slave or servant has a child or they get married, the owners technically have more control over the family because they can always use the threat of selling the children or selling the wife or the husband to a different owner, or selling them to a different plantation, or just selling them back down south if they live further north. So there are a lot of ways where an owner could control a slave or a servant if they had children. There were a lot of mulatto children who were born when an owner forced himself onto his slaves. If you're not sure what the term mulatto means, it just means someone who's of mixed race with white and African American. There are other categories too that I won't get into with this podcast, but just the terms of whiteness or blackness are used for several different terms. One of the easiest examples we have to show how this system worked was Thomas Jefferson. He had relations with his slave, Sally Heming, which she bore a son from Jefferson. This son was considered a slave even though it was Jefferson's child. Some visitors to Jefferson's estate say the slave child looked exactly like Jefferson, only he was a mulatto, which means he has darker skin. So I'm sure it was very weird for some of his colleagues or friends to see a spitting image of Jefferson in a child that wasn't from his wife, but from one of his slaves. As far as we know, Stephenson did not have any children with any of his servants, but I just wanted to give kind of a quick background of why it's easier to keep slavery going if it's through the mother's lineage compared to the father's lineage. In 1818, Benjamin Stephenson was one of the delegates to sign Illinois' first state constitution. This constitution brought much debate for the use of slavery in the state. Since the Northwest Ordinance outlawed the use of slavery in the territory, which I kind of touched upon in the previous podcast, they voted to keep indentured servitude in its place. Now, keep in mind, indentured servitude was legal in the entire country at this time, so they just wanted to use that as a loophole to turn their slaves into servants. Some delegates at this convention wanted gradual emancipation, but many of the delegates, like Stephenson, owned servants and wanted to keep property. During this time, people would want to keep their property because it's one of the most valuable things. So when you have the threat of losing your property, you make laws so that you can keep it. Many servants were some of the most expensive things someone bought, essentially. So it makes sense why the slave holders wanted to keep that going, because they didn't want to have to lose out on property that produced more than what cattle did. And that's what some of the servants would be considered is cattle or livestock. When the Stephenson family first moved to Edwardsville, they lived on Main Street. In 1820, they started construction on their Federal-style home about a mile south of where their Main Street home was. From our research, it looks like the indentured servants built the house for the Stephenson family. All of the materials needed for the house were on the property. They built the house out of brick, so all you really needed was a lot of clay and an open fire kiln on the property to really get the bricks going. Since the home was made out of brick, the younger servants would have been the ones to mix the clay needed for the bricks and the foundation. The older servants would have been the ones who used the open fire kiln to harden the bricks. They also were the ones that would have laid the bricks to form the foundations and then later the whole house. There's about 200,000 bricks that go into the main house, and we are pretty sure that the barn that was on site here was also made out of brick, and their privy, which is also called an outhouse, would have also been made out of brick. So the servants would have been mixing and laying a lot of brick. The house started construction in 1820, but it wasn't finished until mid-1821. When the house was completed, there were two areas for the servants to live. The Stephenson family had dismantled and moved a one-room log cabin to the farm for the family of servants. It had a brick fireplace built in it as well, but this was mainly where the large family of servants would have lived. So those servants who had the 4 children by one of the servants, they're the ones who probably lived in a log cabin structure. The second place where servants lived was above the kitchen. This space was an almost unbearable spot to live in most of the year. During the summertime, it was very hot, and in the winter, it could be deathly cold. The spring and fall were pretty okay times of the year to spend longer amounts in this one room space above the kitchen. If it got to be too hot for the servants, they probably slept outside on pallets. If it was too cold, they probably slept down in the kitchen, where there was at least a small fire going at all times. More servants were indentured to the Stephenson family in 1821. Jess Price and his 10-month-old son, Washing Will, were legally registered as property on July 1st, 1821. We don't have a record of how long the indenture was to last. We know that Jess was labeled as a Negro man, and the birthday of Washing Will was October 5th, 1820. These two were probably the ones who lived in the servants' quarter above the kitchen. Since the larger family of servants lived in the cabin, we assume that since the house was just built, that the newer servants were probably the ones who had lived in the worst space. Now, basic laws were put in place that owners were supposed to care for their servants by providing housing, food, and clothing. We have records that show that the Stephenson family did purchase some pieces of clothing for their servants. One of the stores in town was called Isaac Prickett and Co. Records show that the Stephenson family bought clothing there for the servants. One specific record shows on June 11th, 1821, a checked shirt was bought for Hark. And then there's another record that 2 items were purchased for Dot. In 1822, she received a pair of shoes. In May, she received those pair of shoes and a pair of pumps in June. Both of those items each cost $2.50. We have incomplete records from the mercantiles in Edwardsville, but we assume that everyone else in the servant's household received clothing items as necessary. If the Stephensons followed the basic laws, then that would be the case. In October of 1822, Colonel Stephenson died of malaria. He died without a will, and he owed $48,000 in debt. Lucy had no way of paying such a large amount back, so there was a public auction held. For those who don't know, into today's money, $48,000 is about $1.1 million. There was an inventory taken of all of the items in the Stephenson's house. On that inventory list, the servants were listed as livestock. There was a man and 4 children listed on the inventory list. They were valued at $1,000. They were bought back for $401 by Lucy. Now, Lucy stayed living in the house that they built for several more years, and Lucy was never the same financially, so eventually she would have to either free her servants, or their emancipations were either bought by someone else or they were set free. We have a letter that Lucy wrote to a friend in 1831. In her letter, she stated that Will and the rest of the family took a trip to Ohio, which tells us they were probably freed by this point. In 1831, Louisa attended the same girls' school as Elvira did. This point in the letter is very interesting because it shows that a servant was getting a proper education. So it kind of shows that maybe Lucy wanted to have some of her servants learn the basic skills. We know that Jess and his family moved to Carlinville when Lucy moved there after leaving Edwardsville. After Lucy's death, Jess moved his family to Alton, where they can be found in the census records. After that census, though, we do not know where the family went to next or what happened to them because they're not listed on any other records that we can find. It was recorded that Caroline was sold to several individuals after Lucy moved to Carlinville. She was first sold to William H. Brown, then Brown sold Caroline to Will Lynn, who lived in Vandalia. Will Lynn sold her to Cassius Hackett on May 16, 1837 for $100. After serving 2 more years on her indenture, Caroline was emancipated on May 11, 1839. Lucy moved to Carlinville in 1834, and she had no servants legally bound to her. But 2 freed persons lived with Lucy in Carlinville, but we are unsure of which former servants they were. My guess is that the 2 servants were Tobe and Wynne, which were Lucy's first 2 slaves inherited from her father. If we have more records, we would be able to tell more information, but we don't have many of the records what happened to the other servants that the Stephenson family had. If Ben had lived longer, we would probably have more census data on where the servants went or who they were still owned by. But we just don't have that, and since Ben died in the 1820s, we just really don't know what would have happened. Well, this brings us to an end of the Indentured Servants Podcast. I hope you all learned a little bit more about the servants that the Stephenson family had. Our staff is always researching, so more information could come to light in the future. I hope you all are staying safe and healthy, and we'll see you all next time.